As a fan of Final Fantasy, there are very few things that I find as exciting as the Final Fantasy XIV Ultimate Raid World Races. These encounters are some of the most difficult pieces of content in the entirety of the Final Fantasy franchise. Just to clear these raids requires 8 exceptional players who have both a solid understanding of the encounter's mechanics and the skill to perform optimally. In the earliest clears of these encounters, they are often incredible demonstrations of player competence. But these sorts of encounters didn't begin with Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XI has a long history of releasing very difficult encounters. Most of the time, these encounters came in the form of what players call high notorious monsters. HNMs, as they're called, were usually the pinnacle or most challenging NM inside its own notorious monster system. While even to this day, HNMs are often the most difficult encounters that 11 has to offer, a new type of challenging encounter was added to the game in 2016. This new type of encounter takes place in battlefields, which is 11's version of what 14 calls raids. Now, battlefields in 11 aren't usually that challenging. While they can pose some hurdles for undergeared players, it isn't uncommon for a fully geared job to be able to solo these encounters. These new battlefields were different, however. They were named Master Trials, and the first of these, Black and White, came out on May 10th, 2016. There is quite the story behind the players who were first in the world to clear this Master Trial, but unfortunately, 2016 was a different time in Final Fantasy XI. This was a year following the release of Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, and while plenty of players stuck around for the storyline and some of the additional content, Square Enix essentially made the announcement that 11 was coming to an end. This announcement was even followed up by the shutting down of service for PS2 and Xbox 360. Despite all this talk of shutting the game down, the developers themselves were hard at work on completing and releasing one of the most expansive gameplay loops for endgame that 11 has ever seen. So while the player base began its decline, some of the most robust and interesting pieces of content were released. All of this resulted in a time in 11's history that simply wasn't well documented, and many of the incredible players who were taking on the new content and accomplishing incredible things have unfortunately been forgotten. One of the most notable events was the first clear of the first Master Trial. The story behind this clear is a piece of 11's history that has been all but forgotten. This clear and the group responsible has left a legacy that has shaped much of the modern endgame scene, yet very few people have any recollection of it. In this video, I want to tell you about this legacy before it's lost to time, to shed light on this long-forgotten piece of 11's history, because it's a legacy certainly worth remembering. Early in 2016 came an announcement of this new type of battlefield, and players realized that these Master Trials wouldn't reward anything but cosmetic weapons. As a result, there wasn't a lot of interest in taking on these challenges, but a subset of the most competent, well-geared, and passionate players not only took notice, but decided to progress these fights as early as they could. Upon its release, many players began writing about their first experiences with the fight, noting just how ridiculously difficult it was. To get to this encounter, players had to travel through the Alzadal undersea ruins, which is made up of Alexander's ancient corpse. Immediately after the first group entered Black and White, it was abundantly clear that this wasn't going to be like any battlefield before. Standing in the back of the battlefield was not one, but 2 avatars, which were Odin and Alexander. At the time of release, each of these mobs alone would have posed a respectable challenge for a significant number of the players, but they had to be fought together in this Master Trial. As if these 2 bosses weren't enough for the encounter, along with them, players had to fight all 9 of the Inheriar Valkyries, for a total of 11 bosses. Immediately, many of the best groups in the game began studying this fight, testing mob behaviors, party compositions, strategies, and after several weeks of testing, they realized that this Master Trial was more than just a battlefield with a dozen bosses. Weeks had gone by without a single clear, and some of the best groups in the world were finally discovering what made these new types of encounters unique. Layered on top of the absurdity already mentioned, this encounter had a series of special mechanics that greatly limited the method with which these 11 bosses could feasibly be approached. Pool after pool, day after day, and week after week, the challenge this fight offered seemed to be completely insurmountable. Almost an entire month after the fight was released, an anonymous group of incredible players finally confirmed the world-first clear of Black and White. Even after they published their strategy, though, it took a long time before the second group was able to replicate their results, making this world-first clear that much more unbelievable. And this piece of 11's history that I want to share revolves around this group who managed to clear this master trial impossibly fast. So what made this encounter so insanely difficult? While going into extensive detail about every single mob would require more attention than the scope of this video, there are several key enemies that served as the biggest hurdle in the entire encounter. For starters, Alexander served as a massive HP battery for this encounter, boasting a massive pool of hit points with significantly more defense than any other boss. On top of this massive HP pool, he uses a powerful TP ability after his health drops below 50%, capable of wiping anyone who wasn't tanking, and another move further enhancing his defense. Now, where Alexander lacked in offensive capabilities, Odin more than made up for. Odin has access to a plethora of TP abilities, many of which cause high damage and almost all of which inflict some kind of debuff. Just like Alexander, Odin also reserves 2 specific TP moves for when he falls below 50% of his health. The first of these abilities will fully dispel anyone within range, which could easily destroy a run if the group isn't prepared for this. Furthermore, Odin has access to 2 different forms of Zantetsuken. These are instant death abilities that Odin begins using once the group begins dealing damage to him. The method of surviving these moves wasn't at all obvious initially. These 2 new abilities turned out to be massive hurdles for all of the early prog groups for this encounter, and they had to learn how to deal with these because if even one of these moves caught the team off guard, it could easily lead to a wipe. While I won't go into detail regarding every one of the Valkyries, I do want to discuss 3 in particular. Grimgerd was perhaps the most problematic because this Valkyrie periodically reset all of the mob's enmity. Because of the enmity mechanics in this encounter, it was much more difficult for the tank to hold aggro on all of the mobs, and Grimgerd's enmity reset made tanking this fight significantly harder. This could easily end a run if the tank failed to regain hate quickly enough. Ortland casts AoE buffs on all of the mobs present in addition to high damage output too. And finally, Melwig would pull off devastating weapon skills and magic bursts frequently enough to make focusing on any other mob highly impractical. Despite all of the details I've given, there are plenty more things to this encounter that players had to look out for. The encounter was officially released on May 10th, 2016, and soon after that, groups began making serious progress. But the further into this encounter they were getting, the more they realized that this first Master Trial was truly a new kind of encounter. Now, any observer of the ultimate raids in Final Fantasy XIV will quickly notice that ultimates are the most mechanically dense and mechanically demanding encounters in the game. This trend, in truth, started with their precursor, the Master Trials, which is exactly what many of these top groups were discovering. As if all of the hurdles I've talked about weren't enough, there are several special Master Trial mechanics that added to the challenge. Shortly after the fight was released, the leading group began posting about these mechanics. The first is what I'll call the Guardian mechanic, and the way it works is, so long as any Valkyrie is alive, both Odin and Alexander had access to moves or buffs that made them practically invulnerable to any damage, meaning players had to focus on taking out all 9 Valkyries before focusing on the significantly more complicated avatars. While this mechanic may have been inconvenient, it proved to be nothing compared to the next 2 phases of this fight. After multiple weeks of practice and progression, the top groups were able to consistently defeat the Valkyries, but they found 2 major problems remained. The first was Alexander's HP pool and his massive defense, which combined resulted in a brutal DPS check. The second were Odin's instant death abilities that he started using once his HP began dropping. For this encounter, Alexander's DPS check was so tight at the time that doing all of the required damage to take out Alexander while Odin was whittling away at the tank was less than optimal. So the leading group decided to take out Odin first, in hopes that it would make Alexander easier to deal with in the remaining time. As the teams began progressing through the next phase of the fight, they discovered the second mechanic that proved to be a massive roadblock for several days. The second Master Trial mechanic came in the final phase of the fight, and it occurs when one of the avatars is killed, and it immediately became the bottleneck of the final stretch. For the sake of this video, I'll call the mechanic the Solitude Mechanic, and it comes in two forms. The first form is when Odin dies first and Alexander is left. When this occurs, Alexander uses a powerful attack upon Odin's death, and he gains access to powerful skill chains that put significant pressure on the support, dealing significantly more damage than anything else in this encounter. For the second form of Solitude, that is when Odin is left alive and Alexander dies first, Odin opens the phase up with an extra Shinzan Tetsuken, raising the number of times players have to tank this attack from twice to 3 times. This also forces groups to deal with one of Odin's instant death abilities far earlier than they would have to otherwise. The top team began testing both versions of the mechanic. After proceeding with their initial plans, they found that Alexander's version of the mechanic theoretically could be survived if properly prepared for, yet the party composition required had no realistic way of dealing with the other 10 mobs present for the first 3 phases. So they began testing Odin's version of the mechanic. After several days of testing and progression, they found that both of Odin's instant death abilities could consistently be survived. One could be survived so long as all of those hit by the attack had Utsuzemi shadows up, and the other could be survived as long as all of the players hit had the re-raise buff along with over 1,000 hit points left. The team realized that even having to balance all of the buffs required to survive Odin's instant death abilities while maintaining the required damage output, on top of defending against all of Odin's standard attacks, this version of the mechanic was still more doable than Alexander's version of the Solitude Mechanic. This leading group continued pool after pool for another 2 weeks before they finally got the first clear. As crazy as the story behind the world first clear of Black and White is, there is still far more to this story than even what I've detailed so far. All of the players in the World First team belonged to a Japanese group called Two-Man Cell. Admittedly, I don't have the names of all of the individual players because, for certain reasons beyond the scope of this video, certain groups in Japan choose to keep their in-game characters anonymous, this group included. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, this era of 11 really wasn't well documented, so the sheer talent and skill within this group has been forgotten with time. Even to this day, this group is practically unheard of among English players, and among Japanese players, they are more so remembered for the guides they publish than their monumental skill. I really couldn't help but make a video highlighting this group, however, because their achievements are far more significant than just the world first clear on Black and White. Even after they published their strategy, it took a whole additional month before the second group publicly confirmed a clear, and 2 months before the third. Given the fact that so few players were ever able to clear the fight before it was power crept, the fact that Two-Man Cell was able to clear within a month of its release puts this achievement on an entirely different level. Furthermore, this wasn't the only Master Trial that Two-Man Cell was the first to clear. 2 months after being the first to clear Black and White, they went on to confirm the world first clear of the second Master Trial, Unafraid of the Dark. They were among the first in the world to clear the third Master Trial and continued on making early clears on a plethora of the game's most challenging H&Ms for years to come. Their guides that I mentioned earlier have been some of the most influential guides for many Japanese players over the last decade as well, being highly endorsed by huge names in the Japanese scene such as Lute, the first player in the world to solo most of the challenging Geshvet NMs, Zola's group, which was the first in the world to clear the hardest HNM of Odyssey, and League Millie, a player that's highly informed on all things related to guides and content in the Japanese scene. Two-Man Cell has left a legacy, rivaled by very few groups in 11's history, despite their utter lack of recognition. and I hope that by highlighting their monumental achievements in the Master Trial Black and White, this piece of 11's history will be better preserved. For the world first clear of Black and White, 2-Man Cell's party composition was Paladin sub-warrior, 2 Ranger sub-ninjas, a Scholar sub-red mage, a Geo sub-red mage, and a Corsair sub-white mage. While this may be ridiculously late, I offer a huge congratulations to all the players involved in this group, 2-Man Cell. Now, if you're interested in experiencing this Master Trial as close to the way it was upon release, that actually won't be too difficult. 11 hasn't power crept like most other MMOs over the last decade, but there are certain tiers of gear that you'll need to refrain from using. I've made this table to show what major gear sets you can and can't use within the older Master Trials. Admittedly, this should be taken more as a suggestion rather than a hard limitation, as plenty of players still struggle with this fight despite having a few newer pieces of gear. This video and all of the investigation that the research required would not have been possible if it weren't for Tojozomi, someone who helped me significantly with sifting through all of the old Japanese blog sites detailing the progress on this encounter. Thank you so much for all of the help. When was the first time you cleared Black and White?
According to my testimonial on BG, it was 2017, summer or something.
So it's especially back then before a lot of the power creep hit that Master Trial, right?
Yeah, you can see because I wrote my set in there, and just looking back at that set, I go, oof, times have changed. Anyone does to know the gear. People don't wear anything I was wearing back then, and if they do, it's upgraded to 2-3, not +1. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to do that trial. When it came out, it was challenging. Yeah, and this is also before master levels too. So with Oathworn Blade, you have master levels, and that is pretty much the guys doing that were high 40s, if not capped. At least when they started, they were capped. Some of them de-leveled a couple times along the way.
Well, I know it's been a little while, but what were the main difficulties that you and your group ran into when you were trying to clear this fight, the Black and White Master Trial?
Still off the back of the enmity, so there's things that can reset your enmity completely, or atypical enmity degeneration on certain mobs, or ways enmity will just shift in a fight based on something. So in Black and White, you had atypical things where the enmity itself was a little wonkier and it degenerated in different ways than you would typically expect. But when one of the Valkyries, it's a bard, would sing a lullaby or whatever it was, it would clear the enmity, and then things could get crazy because if all these, you have, what was it, half a dozen of these Valkyries, they can go after your backline and just absolutely decimate them. You have to be able to juggle that enmity, and that was one of the things that made the fight more challenging. The tank, especially at that time with the gear available, surviving an onslaught from these mobs, it was just the enmity could sometimes just screw you, and that happened to us in the fights. Especially when it's a newer fight, something might happen, you might not have seen it happen or whatever, and you weren't prepared for it, and that was one of the many challenges with that fight, besides the mobs skill chaining you, which mobs typically don't do in this game, but the Valkyries can, and if you get a bad skill chain at a bad time from everyone attacking the tank at once, it's game over, there's nothing you're going to do.
I take it you weren't able to take out the Bard right away because there are certain other Valkyries that had really high...
We aimed for the Bard first, if I recall correctly, because of that issue. So once the Bard's down, it's kind of, once you clear that hurdle, you're through as long as you don't die to the bad. And I died in the fight we won, and that ended up taking time, and you'd run around and try and kite to buy time and whatever you could do. But originally, people first beat it at, basically 58 minutes in or whatever out of 60 with Rangers. We took 2 Summoners because Summoners are cool in that fight due to the way the enmity is. And they also helped because Summoner can uniquely reduce enmity on the Corsair we had, because Corsair is just going to get annihilated. And the Corsair can die. It's not like its DPS was crucial, but it was essential to winning because at the time we won with 57 minutes or 3 minutes left.
So if memory serves, and this is just, I guess, for anyone who might be listening, a lot of the earlier clears, they weren't able to deal with the Bard right away because certain of the other Valkyries did too much DPS for the tank to survive. So it's really interesting to hear that you guys were able to kind of bypass some of that.
Well, let's say I have my kill order in here, and it looks like the first one we killed was, I'm not going to try to pronounce Norse things. We did Red Mage, White Mage, so another Red Mage. Did we really do the Bard later? I guess we did. See, this is why it's good to read what you did.
Yeah.
But that's because it's been 8 years.
This is not a new encounter, and that was a very similar to the situation that, if memory serves, the very first group was having. They knew that they needed to take out the Bard as quickly as possible, but it was kind of a bottleneck for a couple days. Actually, they kept trying, and their tank would just die too quickly to some of the other Valkyries.
It can happen. The thing that ended up saving my tank, if I recall, was specifically adding the burden to the Corsair of having a third thing to worry about rolling, and I was getting Gallant's roll, and the extra defense from Gallant's roll from the core having to rotate around, get songs up on me, the summoner, and then itself, so it could do whatever, and some DPS. The Gallant's roll was instrumental in that, along with me at the time trying to conduct the best higher HP cap DT set I could work on.
I guess moving on to question number 2, from your first attempt roughly to the actual clear, do you remember how long it took for your group to get that first clear?
Other people had gone first, of course, and we had the advantage of whatever knowledge was available. We weren't. I mean, I've never been big about any world first or anything. That's not prestigious to me. I want to have fun, and it wasn't too bad for us. There's just something to me about having everyone first going and grinding up stuff nowadays, and then like even if we're a world first, it's not to me as special.
The first clears on Ammonon, at least hard mode Ammonon, and V25 Bomba. That was a lot bigger deal, but it was also because...
The rewards.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, there was some background noise there. It was
Happens.
largely the rewards that people were wanting. This is also one of the reasons that I find Master Trials somewhat interesting, because there's no tier of gear locked behind them. The developers don't really have an incentive to make them easily clearable or to figure out. Which, I mean, if you want to call V25 Bomba easy to figure out, I feel like you're stretching the definition.
Yeah, it definitely was not easy to figure out, and it was someone discovering the cheese method that everyone uses. And as far as I'm concerned on that subject, I think the black and white, even nowadays, is still a better fight than Bumba, because instead of hoping that you do everything correctly and you get the reset you need to win that from the course. I mean, basically, instead of hoping you cheese it, you could straight up just fight that fight, and it was challenging. The tank, it was challenging to tightrope it and with your DPS and everything, and balance out the time and everything in your strategy. You could call it one of the pinnacle sort of fight designs of 11, is to have, first of all, that many enemies. You typically don't have that many enemies in a battle. It complicates things, and there's only so much you can do with the way 11 is designed to have combat. And that fight just kind of works. I mean, they had to balance the power of the Valkyries and everything. They were challenging, they were hardy, they were tough, but they weren't oppressive. Like perhaps with Oathworn Blade, with having fewer mobs, those are definitely more oppressive sorts of stats and stuff to overcome. Not just because it's more modern, but era to era. But at least the whole point was the strategy. Bumba, I'm sure there is a strategy that works without cheesing it with Kastra, but it just doesn't feel to me remotely the same as the sort of, okay, guys, we're going to strategize, we're going to fight, we're going to do our best, and this is winnable in a classic sort of way, not a how can we reduce TP from ever happening, how can we just rely on DOT to kill this thing because it's so random and so dangerous that it's just not the same.
What are your thoughts on Crystal Paradise? I'm not sure if you saw what I wrote up earlier, but it seems like Crystal Paradise was made to borrow a lot of structure and mechanics from Black and White, and furthermore, it's significantly easier than Oathsworn Blade and Wing of War.
Well, I haven't done Crystal Paradise, but having that many mobs again, especially some story-wise infamous mobs within the story of the game, which adds some importance to it for players, whether they realize it or not. Fighting the Archangels and the Zalart bosses, it's kind of, from doing the stories and everything, it's more relatable than just fighting August. But when you have that many mobs, of course, you're going to have to do some interesting things, because they can't just be powerful. That's why fights with more mobs typically have more interesting mechanics, because they have to compensate in a way that makes it strategic without making it just straight up, if you have power, you win. Because that could be kind of boring, I suppose. But those fights usually have more complexity. When I had a group with the Fox Danger and everything, who's perhaps the best player I've ever met, and everyone says it about whatever, but Fox had a way of breaking things down between math and strategy, and then, more importantly, not just those factors, but tying them into the members he had and what jobs could be used and the unique. I mean, because we had a podcast for over 2 years or whatever, and we talked about all of the jobs mechanics, all the things you can do, and he was he was in terms of knowledge and breaking things down, and he would sit there and math stuff out for our groups. I mean, he would see what other people do and he would find it interesting and he would adapt that, but he always would figure stuff out and he would always think about what he has to work with. I don't know how long that guy would spend on it, but when I worked with him on whatever, it would be a joy. And then we could all as a group tinker together and Fox would refine what everyone's ideas or inputs were. And he was the best strategist I think I've played with.
Back when Master Trials first came out, they really did feel like a prototype for Ultimates, because, like, say, a year later, Ultimates came out, and the reward structure seemed a lot more tuned for 14 than it did even for 11 at the time. So something that not a lot of people realize is that Master Trials have always been seen as kind of like almost like side content. There is like a very tight community that seems really, really interested, especially as I've discovered going into Oathsworn Blade and Wing of War. But the vast majority of players do in fact play for gear upgrades, so there's not quite as many people doing Master Trials, it seems. Does that sound about right?
That's absolutely accurate. But hey, I've raised and by I mean my wife. I've raised like 4 chocobos, so that's.
You've also done the older Master Trials, though, too, so...
Yeah, and anyone can do them now, especially Unafraid of the Dark. I bet people could go clear Unafraid of the Dark in 20-ish minutes or whatever.
I guess getting back to Black and White, aside from the enmity mechanics and some of the atypical stuff that you guys had to deal with, were there any other mechanics that you guys found particularly challenging or something that you had to watch out for?
It seems like, if memory serves correct, which is, a loaded phrase, Alexander would focus on closing a skill chain. And I think that is what killed me, is some divine spear into a light skill chain multi-step in my clear. I mean, that would be a challenging mechanic, but sometimes it's not necessarily the mechanics are challenging, but the mechanics require you do things in a different order. For example, Odin was killed last because of his mechanics, not because he was, something you couldn't kill earlier, but he was just the most sensible one to kill last due to the way he worked with his Zanzetsuken or whatever it was, which would take off re-raise and do 1,000 damage. So if you're in the middle of getting pummeled on by 9 Valkyries and Alexander, and there's skill chain issues and mighty strikes, and you're getting enfeebled and also nuked by the red mages, when you're getting pummeled on by all these things, and you're losing re-raise and have to keep reapplying re-raise, and then taking 1,000 damage, which at the time your HP wasn't as high then as it is now. Not that it's drastically different, but between better gear, being able to put on better HP and stuff in your sets, and having master levels adding HP as well, taking all that damage, losing re-raise and stuff while you're getting hit, you just kind of save that for last, because you don't want to add on a big chunk damage while you're trying to handle everything else. If you're feeding Odin TP and he's using Zanzetsuken to chunk off probably about 40% of your HP in one go, you want to save that for last, because you can't handle, or you don't want to have to handle, constantly losing re-raise while also taking large amounts of damage in one go. And the problem was that if Alexander gets a buff, he's even harder to kill, and we only had 3 minutes of leeway time. So because Alexander's defensive, Odin's offensive. If the defensive mob gets even more of a buff, then you're going to take even more time that you didn't have.
You don't want to make the HP battery dangerous, so to speak.
Yeah, so I guess you could call Alexander the HP battery, because he was more of a time-consuming item or an obstacle in the field than, strictly speaking, dangerous. He was his most dangerous if he was able to skill chain off the Valkyries. Nowadays, I'm sure you could just do that and you don't have to worry about Odin doing these things, but back then, when time was an issue, you didn't want to engage in that way, which also made part of the strategy more complex. And as the power creep and everything goes up, these older ones aren't nearly anything they used to be, so you can do those things nowadays, and they are much easier for that reason.
How many mobs exactly, or how many Valkyries did you say your kill order did before getting to the Bard?
I think we basically did the white mages, red mages, that's 4, and then whatever, and then the Bard. So basically everything that wasn't a warrior. So I think we did like 5 or 6 until we got to the Bard, and then we did the warriors after. I just literally put whatever is remaining in my my order.
It's funny, even the very first clear in Japan, as soon as the Bard was taken out, everyone always, they described the rest of those Valkyries, whatever's left, so, yeah, that's funny. When you guys cleared, was it a big celebration, or did you feel like it was pretty easy to that point as far as your strategist went?
Even if it was pretty easy at that point, which it wasn't, there was a big sense of tension throughout the whole thing, because you don't know, because we did lose, and it was at times I want to say disheartening, but it was that pick yourself back up and go back in kind of thing. And I think we did better than because we had the typical issues at the start you get where at the very start something gets screwed up and everyone dies because someone runs in or like that kind of like a bad rehearsal note hit in the recording session. But besides those initial steps there, I mean, that would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. What order did you tackle those first 3 master trials in?
Black and White was first, then Unafraid of the Dark, and then that was before I even met Fox. We were doing those, and then we kind of didn't bother with Sealed Fate due to the mechanics at the time, and we just didn't worry about it. And then later on, Fox was interested in doing Sealed Fate. I didn't go to that one, but I had done Letters from Rise and Jima, and that was a fun fight because it wasn't a black and white, but it was still challenging. The best thing in 11 has always been your friends and your group. I mean, there's always drama within the group. People come and go, whatever. But your friends that you have fun with, you hang out with, you get to know, you become part of their life sometimes, so on and so forth. That's the fun part.
Similarly, like Zero Zero's group, I know one of their members got sick and someone offered to replace, and they didn't accept them because they just wanted to hang out with each other. It's like, why clear if we can't hang out with our friends while doing it, you know?
A lot of it is why clear because we're going to do it again and struggle through it again just for our main guy. So why do it twice? But what's great about 11 is it's facilitated that sort of, even with the demise of the True Alliance content and all that, it's still at its core facilitates on a smaller level now, as it should due to the age of the game and the size of the community and so on. That sort of bond, that camaraderie as part of the game. And if you don't have that in 11, I think as a lot of people might not get into that just by how things work out. Sometimes you meet people, sometimes you don't. I think that is the difference between long-time people staying and enjoying, people quitting even if they play for a long time, or new players not hanging around once they've done the story, quote unquote.
That's a really good point. It's also interesting from my perspective. A lot of people, whether that be in YouTube comments, private messages, or on the forum, they've told me that Master Trials are a waste of time, like for players who are wanting to do 11. So I have a lot of people telling me that, especially since I've been working on the Master Trial series project. On the other hand, however, I also have a handful of players who just recently put a static together. They don't know anything about the game's mechanics, but they learned enough to clear like Unafraid of the Dark for the first time. They and their friends had a ton of fun doing it, and I think, yeah, that's awesome. And that's essentially the point of the game. They didn't get any gear from doing Unafraid of the Dark, but they do have memories, and I feel like that might be a little more lasting, so.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And it's not every player in the base is going to wind up finding that on their own. You would hope that things coalesce at that point naturally throughout the game and people exploring that stuff. But it doesn't always go that way, and people don't always know that. But when you still find that sense of unintended adventure, even though you don't have to do it, that's a big thing 11 was built on, in my opinion. And it's still there. And even nowadays, even though Unafraid of the Dark is easier, to still, as a newer player, it's not going to be as easy. If I logged on today, it would be even easier. But if I was a new player in this game, maybe even for a year or something, depends on the progress you make in that time, depending on how casual you are or not, to rediscover that fight and to be perhaps in my progression in the game, maybe a comparable level, if not still ahead of the curve in various ways from the other gear you could get, and to do that fight, it's not too unlike doing it back in 2016, 17 when people were doing it. Mm-hmm. I mean, you haven't power creeped so hard yet. And to you, these mechanics are new to you. Other people might know them and they might be on the wiki to an extent, but they're still new to you and your group. And there's still that learning curve and you're still going to have silly things happen. And that is essentially, even though it's side content, that's still welcoming, if not more now than it was before, not from a difficulty standpoint, but a exploring 11 kind of standpoint nowadays. So, I mean, they have a lasting purpose using as side content that might be better now than they were when they were released.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now. Really appreciate it, man.
No, I appreciate it as well. Thank you.